London, 1878. A tannery worker in Bermondsey earned 9 shillings a week, 9 shillings, for a family of 4. Food took 4 of those shillings on a good week. On a bad week, it took more, and something else went without. Coal, candles, rent. The arithmetic never changed, only what got cut did. These are the 25 dinners that lived inside that arithmetic. Most of them have no recipe. Most of them have no name that anyone wrote down. They existed because the numbers demanded them, and they vanished when the numbers finally shifted. What the numbers were, and what they produced, that is what this is about. Bread and dripping. That is where it begins, because that is where everything began. Not bread with dripping as a condiment. Bread with dripping as the meal. Bermondsey, 1881, tannery workers. The dripping came from the butcher at the end of the week. The rendered fat collected at the bottom of the roasting tray, the residue of meat that other people had eaten. The butcher sold it for a halfpenny a jar, sometimes less if it was going off. You spread it cold on bread that had already gone stale because fresh bread was Tuesday and this was Friday, and the fat congealed white and grainy at the edges where it had been sitting since morning. The smell was animal and faintly rancid and entirely familiar. A jar lasted 3 days if you were careful. A halfpenny. That was the cost. The butcher charged a halfpenny for what was left after his real customers had finished. The system was efficient in that way. Nothing was wasted. The question of who absorbed the waste was settled before anyone asked it. Bread and dripping disappeared when refrigeration changed how butchers managed their stock. Dripping that once moved fast, because it spoiled now kept longer, which meant it was worth more, which meant the price rose, which meant it was no longer the thing you bought when there was nothing else to buy. A halfpenny became a penny became 2. The arithmetic shifted. The dinner went with it, dripping on toast. Different from bread and dripping in one specific way that mattered enormously at the time and sounds trivial now. The toast. Whitechapel, 1885, match factory workers, women mostly, earning 7 shillings a week when the factory was running full shifts. They toasted yesterday's bread on the range grate in the morning before work, held it on a long fork, or balanced it directly on the iron. And the heat drove the staleness out and opened the surface so the dripping ran in rather than sitting on top. The bread became something different. Crisp at the edges, warm through. The fat soaked into the grain rather than coating it. One woman writing to a charity board in 1887 described it as the best part of the day. She was not being sentimental. She meant it as information. The toast took 3 minutes and cost nothing beyond what the bread and dripping already cost. That 3 minutes was the entirety of the luxury available to her before a 12-hour shift began. Penny soup, not a recipe, a transaction. Spitalfields, 1874, casual dock laborers, the ones who did not get selected at the morning call and had to find something else before trying again at noon. The soup kitchens run by various charitable societies sold a pint of broth for 1 penny, sometimes thick with barley or broken lentils, sometimes almost clear, depending on the day and the supply and the judgment of whoever was ladling. The men stood in a queue that began forming before 6 in the morning. By 8, the better batches were gone. What remained in the bottom of the vat by midday was thin and gray and tasted of the pot more than anything else. 1 penny. Against a casual laborer's daily uncertainty, no guaranteed wage, no guaranteed work, 1 penny represented a calculation so fine that men genuinely weighed whether spending it on soup was better than saving it toward a chance at an afternoon's work that might not come. The charitable societies recorded the numbers of men served. They did not record the ones who left the queue because they had done the calculation and decided differently. Penny soup kitchens closed not because poverty ended, but because the model changed. The Charity Organization Society, by the 1880s, had concluded that indiscriminate relief created dependency. The soup kitchens were reorganized, restricted, made conditional on proof of circumstances. The queue shortened. The problem did not. Stale bread pudding, not a dessert, a dinner. Hoxton, 1876, rag and bone sorters, women and older children working from home, paid by the weight of what they processed. The bread that had gone beyond eating, hardened past the point where even toasting helped, green at one edge. Smelling of the damp in the walls, was broken into a pot with water and whatever was available. Sometimes a scrape of lard, sometimes an onion that had softened past usefulness. The pot sat on the range for an hour, sometimes two, until the bread had dissolved entirely into a thick paste that held the shape of the spoon when you lifted it out. It was eaten hot, directly from the pot, because there was no reason to move it to a bowl. The pot was the bowl. It cost the price of the fuel to cook it. The bread itself cost nothing because it was the bread that would otherwise be thrown out, and throwing things out was not something that happened in Hoxton in 1876. Boiled onions, 3 onions. That was sometimes the entire content of the meal. St. Giles, 1869, the worst of the London rookeries before the clearances began. Families in single rooms, with no cooking range, only a small grate, sometimes shared with the family in the next room through a hole in the wall. Onions boiled in water until they collapsed, the water drunk as the broth, the onions eaten with fingers because there were not always utensils. 3 onions cost a penny at the cheapest stalls on Saturday night, the ones selling what the market vendors had not moved by closing. The sweetness that comes out of an onion when you boil it slowly for 40 minutes, that was not a flavor choice. That was the only flavor available. 3 onions, 1 penny, 4 people. The rookeries came down through the 1870s under slum clearance legislation. The people moved east to Whitechapel and Stepney into slightly better rooms at slightly higher rents, which meant the food budget contracted further. The onions went with the rookeries, but only from certain addresses. Fried fish scraps. Limehouse, 1880. River workers and their families living near enough to the fish market that the end-of-day scraps were accessible. Not fish. The scraps of fish, the bits broken off in handling, the pieces too small or too irregular to sell, the tails and collars and thin strips along the bone that the fishmongers separated out before weighing. These were sold by the pailful for a penny or two, or sometimes given away rather than discarded. Fried in a pan with a scrape of lard, they crisped at the edges in about 4 minutes over a high flame, and the smell was sharp and immediate and filled the stairwell of the building. The sound was a hard sizzle that went quieter as the moisture cooked off. What you ate was mostly batter and edge and the suggestion of fish underneath. It was better than it sounds. It was gone in 3 minutes. The meal from acquisition to consumption took less than 20 minutes total, which was its other virtue. In households where the range was shared and time at the fire was competed for, speed was its own form of value. Fishmongers began selling scraps less freely as the wholesale trade consolidated in the 1880s, and the value of byproducts became better understood. What had been given away became a product with a price. The price made it no longer what it had been. Oatmeal gruel. Manchester, 1865. Cotton mill workers. Night shift women returning home at 5 in the morning. Oatmeal stirred into boiling water until it thickened, salted, sometimes thinned with a little skim milk if the milk had come that week. The stirring took 10 minutes and had to be continuous, or the oatmeal settled and burned on the bottom. The sound was a slow, heavy plop-plop as the surface broke and reset. The color was gray-white. The texture was thick enough to coat the back of the spoon and leave a line when you drew your finger through it. It was eaten standing at the range because sitting down after a night shift meant not getting up again, and the children had to be dressed for school. A pound of oatmeal cost 2 halfpenny and lasted the week if you measured it. The skim milk cost a penny for a pint, and sometimes the pint had been watered before it reached the door. This was known. The milkman was known. The alternative was no milk at all, which was worse. Oatmeal gruel did not disappear. It was reclassified. The same substance, renamed porridge. migrated upward through the class system during the 1880s and 1890s as Scottish dietary habits were romanticized following the Queen's attachment to Balmoral. What had been subsistence food in Manchester became respectable breakfast food in middle-class households in the same decade. The mill workers who had eaten it out of necessity watched it acquire a reputation they would not have recognized. Barley broth. Sheffield, 1873, cutlery grinders. Men whose lungs were already compromised by the metal dust and who rarely lived past 50. A shin bone from the butcher, the cheapest cut, sometimes given free as a courtesy, boiled for 3 hours with a cup of pearl barley, a turnip, an onion. The bone first, into cold water, brought slowly to a simmer, the gray foam skimmed off and discarded. Then the barley, which swelled to triple its dry volume and thickened the liquid to something that moved slowly when you tilted the pot. Then the vegetables, cut rough, cooked until they no longer held their shape. The total cost was 2pence for the barley, a penny for the vegetables. The bone was the variable. Sometimes free, sometimes a penny, sometimes the butcher was out of them entirely. The broth fed 4 people and could be stretched to 5 with more water and another handful of barley. The cutlery grinders ate this 3 nights a week, not because it was what they wanted, but because it was what the 2pence produced. Barley broth persisted longer than most things on this list because the ingredients were stable and cheap and the method required no skill. What changed was the shin bone. As the meat trade rationalized in the 1880s and 1890s, bones became a commodity sold to rendering plants and gelatine manufacturers rather than given to customers or sold cheaply at the end of the day. Without the free bone, the broth cost a penny more. That penny was not a small thing. Boiled nettles. Here is where the list breaks its own pattern, because boiled nettles were not exclusively a poor man's dinner. Shropshire, 1862. Agricultural laborers in spring, yes, picking nettles from the hedgerow when the stores were exhausted and the new season's vegetables had not yet come in, boiling them for 20 minutes until they lost their sting and collapsed into dark green ribbons tasting of iron and earth, salted, eaten on bread. That was poverty. But in the same decade, in the same county, farmers' wives were putting nettle soup on the table in March for entirely different reasons. Because it was the first green thing available after winter, and because there was a long tradition, reaching back well before Victoria, of treating nettles as a spring tonic. The plant was the same. The meaning was different. The laborer's wife picked nettles because there was nothing else. The farmer's wife picked nettles because she had always picked nettles in March. Same hedgerow, same boiling time, same iron taste. The class system ran through the middle of the recipe and did not touch the food itself. Nettles vanished from tables at both ends when the railway distribution of fresh vegetables made spring scarcity obsolete. The hedgerow and the market competed, and the market won, because the market had no season. Peas pudding. Not as a side dish, as the entire meal. Newcastle, 1871, keelmen working the river coal trade. Dried split peas, soaked overnight, boiled for 2 hours, drained, mashed with salt and a scrape of lard, pressed into a cloth and boiled again until it held its shape. The result was yellow-green, dense, slightly grainy at the center, smooth at the edges where the cloth had compressed it. It sliced. That was the point. It sliced, which meant it could be portioned exactly, which meant a family of 5 could be fed from a single vessel with mathematical precision. 4 pence for enough peas to feed 5 people. You understand what that means? 4 pence. And it was hot, and it was filling, and it sat in the stomach for hours, which mattered enormously when the next meal was uncertain. Peas pudding was also sold from street stalls throughout the Northeast for a halfpenny a slice, which meant it served as fast food for working men who had no time and no kitchen access. The stall holders made it in large batches the night before and reheated it through the morning. By midday, it had dried slightly at the cut edges and the surface had darkened. You ate it standing up, The stallholder did not provide utensils. Boiled sheep's head, Leeds 1868, wool sorters and dye workers. A whole sheep's head from the slaughterhouse, eyes in, brain in, tongue still attached, purchased for tuppence or threepence from the parts that the butcher could not otherwise move. Placed in a large pot, covered with cold water, brought slowly to a simmer with an onion, a carrot, salt. Boiled for 2 hours. The tongue came loose from its root after about 90 minutes and floated free. The brain softened inside the skull and had to be spooned out through the eye socket or through a cut made at the base. The cheek meat, and there is more meat on a sheep's cheek than most people have ever considered, pulled cleanly from the bone in thick, soft strips after the full 2 hours. The broth was rich enough to set to jelly when cold, which meant tomorrow's meal was the jelly on bread. Nothing was discarded. The bones were cracked for marrow. The teeth were not the concern of anyone who needed to eat that week. The sight of a sheep's head at a market stall was unremarkable in Leeds in 1868. By 1895, the same stall in the same market would have arranged its display differently because the expanding lower middle class that was moving into working class neighborhoods had different ideas about what a market should look like. The heads moved to the back, then to specialist stalls, then largely out of sight. Respectability was a force that operated on butchers' displays as reliably as it operated on everything else. Trotters. Pig's feet. Salford, 1877, factory hands in the textile districts. Purchased from the pig butcher for a penny each, sometimes 2 for a penny on Saturday afternoon. Boiled for 3 hours until the skin loosened and the gelatin in the bones had entirely dissolved into the cooking water. The meat, and there is meat between the toes and along the shank, stringy but present, pulled away with the fingers. The cooking water set overnight into a firm jelly in the pot, seasoned with salt and a little vinegar if vinegar was available. The jelly was tomorrow's breakfast spread on bread. The trotters themselves were eaten at the table with fingers and a great deal of working at the bones with teeth, because that was the only way to get what was there. They were sold cooked from street stalls as well, for a penny each, already boiled and cooling. Men ate them walking. The bones went in the gutter. Nothing about this required explanation or apology in Salford in 1877. It was Tuesday. Pig trotters did not disappear. They survived in specialist butchers and in the cooking of communities that emigrated into industrial England from Ireland and later from the Caribbean, each group carrying the knowledge of how to use the whole animal because that knowledge had always been practical rather than cultural. What disappeared was the English working class relationship to them. That relationship ended when the wages rose just enough that the pig's foot became a choice rather than a necessity. And choices have a way of revealing preferences that necessity had kept hidden. Turnip soup. Bradford, 1869, worsted mill workers. Turnips from the market, the ones going soft at the edges, sold cheap because they were past their best. 2 or 3 for a penny at the end of Saturday trading. Peeled, cubed, boiled in water with salt and a small piece of onion. The turnip cooked in 20 minutes and released a slightly bitter, faintly sulfurous smell that filled the room, and was simply the smell of Tuesday in Bradford. Mashed roughly in the pot and thinned back to a soup with the cooking water. No cream, no butter, no stock. The soup was white and thin, and the mashed pieces floated in it. It tasted of nothing except turnip and salt, and the slight metallic quality of the Bradford water itself. It was eaten because it was hot, and because it was there. The mill workers who ate it did not describe it. There was nothing to describe. Turnip soup persisted in Bradford longer than in London, because the mill towns of the West Riding lagged a decade or more behind London in the wage improvements of the late Victorian period. When the improvements came, turnip soup went immediately. There was no nostalgia for it. None. Bread and treacle, not syrup. Treacle, black treacle, the byproduct of sugar refining, thick and bitter and dark as tar. East London, 1880, sugar refinery workers and their neighbors. The refineries around Whitechapel produced treacle as a byproduct and sold it in large tins at prices that reflected its status as a residue rather than a product. A tin that lasted a week cost twopence. The bread was day-old at minimum. The treacle spread thick and slow because cold treacle barely moves, and you heated the knife blade over the range flame to make it spreadable, and the smell was immediately sweet and slightly burnt and completely unlike anything else. The color on the bread was deep brown-black, almost uniform, and the bread underneath was invisible. Children liked it. Adults ate it because it was calories, and because sugar, even in this form, was available in East London in ways it had not been a generation earlier, when the refineries were smaller and the byproduct less abundant. The sweetness was the point. Not luxury sweetness, functional sweetness, energy sweetness. The body knows the difference between the two even if the mind does not make it explicit. Bread and treacle declined as refined white sugar became cheaper and more widely available through the 1890s, and golden syrup, sweeter, cleaner in flavor, less bitter, became the standard cheap sweetener. Black treacle did not disappear from the pantry entirely, but it moved from staple to occasional ingredient, used for baking rather than eaten directly. The tin lasted longer. The hunger it had answered had found a different answer. Dock pudding. This one requires a map. The Lake District, Cumbria, 1860s and 1870s, agricultural laborers and smallholders in the valleys. Not dock leaves as most people imagine them, large, flat, slightly rubbery. Specifically beestort, a plant that grows in the valley meadows, combined with oatmeal, nettles, onion, and whatever fat was available. The leaves were boiled first, then the oatmeal was stirred in to bind the mixture. Then the whole thing was pressed into a pudding shape and fried in a pan in bacon fat or lard. The outside crisped brown. The inside stayed green and dense and tasted of the meadow, not unpleasant, specifically flavored. The kind of flavor that attaches to a place so firmly that you cannot eat it without being in that place in your mind. The cost was almost nothing. The leaves were free. The oatmeal was a penny. Dock pudding is the item on this list that did not fully disappear. It survived in one specific valley in Cumbria through a combination of geographic isolation and the stubborn loyalty of families who had eaten it for generations. By the 1890s, it was already a curiosity, something the older women made, and the younger ones photographed with the same mild archaeological interest. It competed with the railway, which had brought cheaper food into the valleys by 1880, and it lost the competition everywhere except where the competition had not quite reached. Calves' foot jelly. This one sat on tables that were not poor at all, and that is the point. Because calves' foot jelly in 1860 appeared in the kitchens of invalid care in middle-class households as a restorative food, recommended by physicians for the sick and the elderly. Mrs. Beeton's instructions for it run to several paragraphs and call for sherry and lemon. What the middle-class household consumed as medicine, the working-class household in Shoreditch consumed as food, made from the same animal part, by the same long boiling method, but without the sherry, without the lemon, without the physician's endorsement, and without the cut glass bowl it was served in. The calves' feet cost twopence from the tripe dresser. Boiled for 6 hours, strained through cloth, left to set overnight. The jelly that came out was pale gold and clear and tasted of nothing much except gelatin and salt. It sustained people who were ill because it was digestible. It sustained people who were not ill because it was cheap and filling and required no teeth to eat, which in the absence of dental care was not a small consideration. Calves' foot jelly declined from both ends simultaneously. The middle-class version was replaced by proprietary invalid foods, Bovril, brand's essence, that were heavily marketed as scientific improvements on home methods. The working-class version was replaced by the same products as prices fell and distribution improved. The tuppence that bought a calf's foot became the tuppence that bought a small tin of beef extract. The tin had a label. The label conferred a legitimacy the tallow yellow jelly never had. Fried bread. Simple. Almost insultingly simple. But this is the point of what fried bread was in working-class households across Birmingham, 1875. Not a vehicle for eggs, not a breakfast side, not anything except fried bread as the meal. Day-old bread cut thick, fried in the pan drippings from whatever had been cooked before. The fat left in the pan after the bacon rasher that one person ate, or the dripping from the previous night's meat, or plain lard if there was nothing else. The bread went into a hot pan and took 2 minutes per side. The color was deep golden on the outside, and the interior stayed slightly soft because the fat did not penetrate fully. The smell was the best smell in the kitchen on a cold morning, which is a sentence that means something specific when the kitchen is one room and the room is cold in December in Birmingham. It cost the price of the bread and the price of whatever fat was already in the pan. If the pan had run dry, you needed lard, and lard cost money, and the meal became more expensive, which changed its character entirely. Fried bread persisted. Of everything on this list, fried bread persisted most aggressively, migrating upward and outward until it became a component of the full English breakfast, which is to say, it was absorbed by a more elaborate meal structure and ceased to be a meal in itself. That transition happened slowly through the last decades of the Victorian era, as wages rose enough that the components of the full breakfast became individually affordable. The fried bread remained. Its solitude did not. Savory ducks, not birds. The name was the joke, or the marketing, depending on how you read it. Wolverhampton, 1877, ironworks laborers. Faggots, pork liver, heart, and lights mixed with breadcrumbs, onion, and seasoning, formed into balls and baked in the oven, wrapped in caul fat. The lacy membrane from the pig's stomach that held them together and basted them from the outside as it rendered. The caul fat came from the pig butcher for almost nothing, because almost nothing is what it was worth to anyone who was not specifically making faggots. The offal, liver, heart, lights, cost 4p for enough to feed 6. The breadcrumbs were the end of the stale loaf. The onion was a penny. The whole thing baked for 40 minutes in a moderate oven. The caul fat turning transparent and golden. The exterior of each ball darkening and crisping where the fat had bubbled through. They were sold from bakehouse windows in Wolverhampton and the surrounding black country for a halfpenny each. You could smell them from the end of the street. Savory ducks, faggots, survived in the black country and parts of Wales with a tenacity that most foods on this list did not manage. They survived because the communities that ate them were geographically coherent enough to maintain the supply chain for offal and caul fat, even as those components became less common in other markets. They became regional. Regionality is how foods survive when economic necessity no longer forces them on people. You eat them because you are from there, not because you have to. The mechanism that produced them was forgotten. The food remained. Stirabout. Ireland and the Irish communities of Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow throughout the 1840s and well into the 1870s. This was oatmeal or cornmeal stirred continuously in boiling water, the stirring constant without pause, the right hand on the stick for 15 minutes minimum, the left hand steadying the pot, the porridge thickening as the starch released, the surface bubbling thickly and slowly like something geological. The stirring could not stop because stopping produced lumps, and lumps in stirabout were a failure of technique that people noticed and mentioned. Liverpool, 1860, dock laborers, mostly Irish-born or first generation, eating stirabout in the morning before a day of unloading ships. The meal cooked in a pot that had been on the low heat since before anyone woke, the stirring resuming where it had paused. A pound of oatmeal cost 2.50. It fed a family of 5 for breakfast for 2 days. Stirabout in the Irish communities of Victorian England carried a specific weight that turnip soup in Bradford did not. It was not merely sustenance, it was continuous. It was the food that had been eaten through the famine decade when cornmeal rations were distributed by relief committees to people who had no cooking equipment and no fuel, and ate the raw meal because there was no alternative. Stirabout was the memory of what the alternative to stirabout had been. The Liverpool dock laborers who ate it in 1860 were not eating it because they had forgotten the 1840s. They were eating it because they had not. Cold dripping toast. Different from bread and dripping in a way that requires explanation. Poplar, 1883, Thames lightermen and their families. The dripping that had been used to cook with, the fat rendered from whatever meat had been in the house during the week, collected in a basin and left to cool, set cold into layers. The top layer was clear and pale, almost white. The bottom layer, where the meat juices had settled, was dark brown and gelatinous and tasted intensely of whatever animal had produced it. On cold dripping toast, you spread both layers onto toast, the clear fat and the dark jelly together. The contrast between the mild fat and the concentrated savory jelly at the bottom of the basin, that contrast was the entirety of the flavor experience, and it was a real experience, not an imagined one. The basin lasted the week if the week had been good. On weeks when there had been no meat, the basin had nothing in it, and the toast was eaten dry. Skilly. Workhouse skilly. This belongs on this list not because people chose it, but because the workhouse system made it mandatory for hundreds of thousands of people who had no other option. The workhouses of London and the industrial north throughout the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s served skilly as the morning meal. Oatmeal gruel, extremely thin, sometimes just oatmeal-flavored water, occasionally with a small amount of salt. The Andover workhouse scandal of 1845, in which inmates were found to be cracking bones assigned to them for crushing to eat the marrow because skilly was insufficient to sustain them, produced a parliamentary inquiry. The inquiry produced reforms. The reforms were inconsistent. Skilly continued, in modified form, in workhouses across England for the remainder of the Victorian period. 1 pint per person. 1 pint. No variation. No seasoning beyond salt. The diet sheet for the Lambeth Workhouse in 1866 shows skilly on 6 of 7 mornings. The 7th morning offered a slightly thicker gruel as a concession to Sunday. Skilly was not a recipe. It was a policy. The men who set the diet sheet were not thinking about food. They were thinking about costs and about the principle, held firmly and formally by the poor law system, that the workhouse diet must never be more comfortable than the diet available to the lowest independent laborer outside, or else there would be no deterrent to pauperism. The logic was stated plainly in official documents. The skilly was the logic made edible. You understand what that means. Baked potato. The simplest thing on this list. The cheapest. A potato. 1 potato. Baked in the range ash or directly on the grate. Skin blackening, the interior softening and steaming, the smell of the starch converting to sugar as the heat penetrated. Islington, 1874. Costermongers' families. Also sold from street barrows throughout London for 1 halfpenny, sometimes a farthing, kept hot in the barrow under a metal hood. The potato seller on Oxford Street in 1869 sold 300 potatoes on a cold December day, 300 halfpennies. That was his gross. His costs came out of it. What remained was what the day had been worth. A baked potato cost a halfpenny, a farthing in some places. The man who ate it standing in a doorway off the Strand on a December evening in 1872 was not thinking about poverty. He was thinking that his hands were warm and the potato was hot, and that in 10 minutes he would need to think about what came next. The potato solved the next 10 minutes. In the arithmetic of a Victorian poor man's evening, that was not nothing. Every system produces its own cuisine. Victorian England produced these. When the supply chains changed, when the wages shifted, when the bones became commodities and the nettles became curiosities and the oatmeal became porridge and the workhouse diet became a scandal rather than a policy, the food went with it. What replaced the food was something else. What replaced the system was a different question entirely, not one this list answers. The list only shows what the system ate, 11 pence a day, for 5 people. Now you know what that looked like.